Rebecca Hayes had been working as a curator at the Chicago Historical Society for almost 15 years. She believed she had seen it all. Boxes filled with forgotten photos, old yellow papers, and faded letters. Each one told a piece of the story of a city that had risen from muddy roads to tall buildings of steel and glass. But on a freezing January morning in 2024, while sorting through a new donation from an estate sale on the South Side, she noticed something that would change everything she thought she knew about Chicago's past. The photograph was hidden between layers of newspaper from 1905, wrapped carefully in brown paper, as if someone meant to protect it forever. The picture showed a wedding couple, a young man in a dark suit standing stiffly beside a woman in a high-collared white dress. Her face was serious, almost sad. Behind them stood a small group of guests, posed stiffly, their faces slightly blurred by the long exposure times common in that era. The painted studio background suggested formality and tradition, but something about the scene felt off. Rebecca lifted the photograph toward the light coming through her office window. The backdrop was normal for the time, painted columns and flowing fabric meant to show wealth and elegance. Yet something about the image felt strange, even disturbing. There was tension in the couple's posture, a rigidity that went beyond the usual stiffness of early 20th century photography. The groom's jaw was tightly clenched, and the bride's knuckles were pale where her hands were locked together. Their eyes carried something Rebecca had noticed in other photos taken during troubled times: fear. She placed the photo on her desk and reached for her digital scanner. Modern technology had completely changed the way historians like Rebecca worked. High-resolution scanning could reveal details the naked eye could not see: scratches, notes, even objects hidden in shadow or buried by time. She carefully set the photograph in place and began the scan. The machine hummed softly in the quiet room as it captured every detail of the century-old image. When the picture appeared on her computer screen, Rebecca leaned closer, adjusting contrast and brightness with steady, practiced movements. The faces of the couple became clearer. The groom had dark eyes and a strong jaw, his expression intense and hard to read, as if he were preparing for something. The bride looked younger, maybe 19 or 20, with gentle features and hands tightly clasped at her waist. Her eyes seemed filled with both fear and resolve, emotions that somehow broke through the limits of early photography. Then Rebecca zoomed in on the lower part of the photograph, studying the floor beneath the couple's feet with growing interest. Her breath stopped. There, partly hidden by the bride's long dress and its shadow, lay a small metal object that clearly did not belong. Rebecca adjusted the digital settings, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard with skill built from years of experience. The object slowly became clearer with each adjustment. It was round, about the size of a silver dollar, with raised letters around the edge and some kind of symbol in the center. She zoomed in further, her eyes narrowing as she tried to read the details through the limits of old photography and the deep shadows covering part of it. The metal surface reflected the studio lights in a way that suggested it had fallen there not long before the picture was taken. There was a shine to it, a brightness that showed it had not been lying there very long. The way the light hit it suggested polished metal, something once worn proudly before it dropped to the floor. Rebecca felt a familiar thrill run down her spine, the same feeling she got whenever a historical mystery began to reveal itself. When the past reached forward with hidden truths, she reached for her reference books, pulling a thick volume on early Chicago labor history from the shelf behind her desk. Something about the year, 1905, stirred her memory, a half-forgotten lecture from graduate school or an article she had read long ago about violence and unrest in the city's streets. She flipped through pages filled with photos of street scenes, protests, and workers standing in angry crowds, staring boldly into the camera. Then she found it, a chapter titled "The Teamsters' Strike of 1905, Chicago's Bloodiest Labor Conflict." Rebecca read quickly, her heart beating faster with each paragraph, her trained mind already linking the facts together. From April through July of that year, Chicago had turned into a battlefield unlike anything it had seen since the Haymarket Affair. The United Brotherhood of Teamsters had joined a sympathy strike to support garment workers at Montgomery Ward, and city employers responded with shocking violence. 21 people were killed in street fights. More than 400 were hurt in daily riots that turned entire neighborhoods into combat zones. Newspapers called it a class war, and that was no exaggeration. Employers armed strikebreakers with Winchester rifles. Workers fought back with rocks, clubs, and whatever they could find. The police, siding with business owners, beat strikers without mercy. Rebecca looked again at the photograph on her screen, her thoughts racing. April 1905. The timing fit perfectly with the start of the strike. She zoomed back in on the metal object, adjusting sharpness and contrast until the details stood out more clearly. Now she could see it better. The round shape, the careful design, the way it had been made to be worn proudly on a lapel or chest. It was clearly some kind of badge. Dr. Robert Patterson taught labor history at Northwestern University, and his office looked exactly as Rebecca had imagined when she called him that afternoon. Shelves packed with books from floor to ceiling, walls cove, read in old photos of strikes and protests, and stacks of papers fighting for space on every surface. He was a legend in the field, known for writing key works on Chicago's labor movement. He studied the enhanced photograph through a magnifying glass, his aged hands steady despite his 70 years, grey eyebrows pulled together as he examined every detail. "This is remarkable," he said quietly, never looking up from the image spread across his crowded desk. "Do you see this marking here? The unique design around the edge?" He pointed with a slightly shaking finger to part of the badge Rebecca had struggled to understand. "This is a Teamsters local badge. I believe it belongs to Local 710, one of the most aggressive groups during the 1905 strike. They were based on the South Side, mostly Irish and German immigrants who worked in the stockyards and freight lines. These men were brave, and they paid a heavy price for it." Rebecca leaned in, notebook open, pen ready. She asked what was happening in April 1905 and why someone would wear such a badge to a wedding. Dr. Patterson set the magnifying glass down and slowly walked to a filing cabinet, his knees creaking from arthritis earned after years bent over archives. He pulled out a folder packed with old newspaper clippings, handling them with deep respect, each one a piece of nearly forgotten history. The strike began in December 1904 when garment workers at Montgomery Ward walked out over union rights, but it erupted in early April when the Teamsters joined in support. That was when the real violence began, when Chicago turned into a killing ground. He spread several newspapers across his desk, pushing books aside to make space. The headlines shouted chaos in bold letters, blood in the streets, Teamsters clash with police, 20 injured in South Side riot. Rebecca read stories of rocks crashing through windows, gunfire on busy streets, and men beaten in daylight as crowds watched in fear. The Employers Association armed strikebreakers with Winchester rifles, Dr. Patterson continued, his voice heavy with anger that time had not erased. They brought men in from other cities, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, even New York, offering high wages and weapons. They were told to shoot anyone who blocked deliveries. That spring, the city became a war zone. Mayor Dunn either could not control it or chose not to. The next morning, Rebecca stood outside Kowalski Photography Studio on Milwaukee Avenue, one of the few businesses from 1905 that still existed in any form. Now it operated under new ownership and focused on modern digital photography. The building looked old, its brick front worn down by more than a century of harsh Chicago winters. Mortar crumbled in spots, windows had been replaced many times, yet the original shape remained. A small bell rang as she pushed open the heavy wooden door, its brass handle smoothed by countless hands. Inside, the current owner, Thomas Kowalski, the great-grandson of the founder, greeted her kindly. He was in his 60s with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands stained by photochemicals. He still practiced traditional photography along with digital work. Dr. Patterson called ahead, he said with a smile, motioning toward a back room with clear excitement. He said she was looking for records from 1905 and added that he was excited. Someone was finally interested in the old days. He told her his family's history was locked inside those books. The storage room was small and dusty, packed with boxes stacked up to the ceiling in shaky towers. The air smelled of old paper, leather, and something hard to describe that clearly spoke of age. Thomas pulled down a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle with time, the binding cracked but still holding together. He explained with clear pride that his great-grandfather kept very careful records. Every photograph, every client, every payment was written down. He was German and very exact about documentation. He believed photographs were historical records, not just family keepsakes. Rebecca's hands shook slightly as she opened the ledger and searched the entries for April 1905. The handwriting was graceful but faded, written in iron gall ink that had turned brown over the years. Each line listed a name, a date, and the type of photograph. Weddings, family portraits, memorial photos of the dead, all carefully recorded in neat columns with German precision. Then halfway down the page for April 14th, she saw it. Wedding photograph, Joseph Novak and Anna Kowalski. Payment received, 350. Emergency session, late evening. Kowalski, Rebecca said, looking up at Thomas as excitement grew. Same last name as your family? Thomas nodded slowly, his face changing. It was a common Polish name in the neighborhood back then, but then he paused. Anna Kowalski married someone named Novak. He reached up and pulled another box from a high shelf. Inside were old family records, letters, and photographs. He explained that his great-grandfather had a sister named Anna who vanished from family records around 1905. His grandmother said Anna married against the family's wishes, and they cut her off completely. The family never mentioned her again, as if she had died. Rebecca spent the next 3 days deep in the Chicago Public Library's archives, surrounded by microfilm machines and boxes of historical documents that smelled of chemicals and forgotten years. The tight research room on the 3rd floor carried the scent of old paper and the heavy mustiness of century-old newsprint. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as she scrolled through newspaper after newspaper, her eyes aching after hours of reading tiny print on glowing screens. The Chicago Tribune from April 1905 showed a city falling into chaos and violence. Every day brought new headlines about the Teamsters' strike, each more frightening than the last. On April 7th, riots broke out when Montgomery Ward tried to move goods, using strikebreakers guarded by armed men. 1,000 striking workers and supporters attacked the wagons on Union Street, overpowering the guards. 3 men were shot during the fighting. 5 others were beaten so badly they had to be hospitalized. On April 29th, another clash left 2 people dead and 5 critically wounded. Their names were listed in small print at the bottom of the article. But a short article from April 15, 1905, just 1 day after the wedding photograph, made Rebecca's hands freeze on the microfilm knob, her breath catching in her chest. The headline read, "Organizer vanishes after Southside violence." Her heart raced as she leaned closer, reading every word carefully. The article was brief, only 3 paragraphs hidden on page 7 between ads for patent medicine and department store sales. A man named Joseph Novak, age 27, described as a known Teamsters organizer and agitator, had disappeared after a confrontation near the stockyards. Witnesses said they saw him chased by several men holding clubs and shouting threats. His wife, recently married according to public records, had filed a missing person report. The investigation found nothing. Police claimed no witnesses would speak, though the article suggested people were simply too afraid. Rebecca printed the article with shaking hands and immediately searched for more mentions of Joseph Novak. Over the next 2 hours, she found 3 more references in different newspapers. One Tribune editorial described him as a troublemaker who stirred honest workers with radical ideas. Another article from a pro-labor paper called The Worker's Voice praised him as a hero of the working class, fearless in his fight for justice and dignity. The sharp contrast showed how deeply divided Chicago had become. The 3rd article, dated May 3, 1905, reported that Joseph Novak's body had been pulled from the Chicago River near the Harrison Street Bridge by dock workers unloading a freight boat. The official cause of death was drowning, but the report mentioned suspicious injuries that suggested a severe beating before he entered the water. Rebecca's next discovery came from an unexpected place, a dusty box of immigration and naturalization records she had requested from the National Archives facility in Chicago. While reviewing citizenship papers from the 1940s, she found a 1942 naturalization document for Anna Novak. She had become a U.S. citizen at age 57, many years after arriving as a child from Poland. The document listed her as a widow and gave an address in Bridgeport, a working-class South Side neighborhood that had been home to immigrant families for generations. Property records showed the house stayed in the family for 3 generations, passed from Anna to her daughter and then to her granddaughter. After several phone calls and a careful explanation of her research, Rebecca found herself standing on the porch of a modest brick house on a tree-lined street. She was greeted by an elderly woman named Helen, Anna's granddaughter, now in her 70s but still carrying her grandmother's sharp eyes. "My grandmother died in 1968, Helen said, as she led Rebecca into a living room filled with old furniture covered in embroidered doilies and family photos spanning 100 years. But she talked about her husband until the very end. She never remarried. She said Joseph was the only man she ever loved, and no one could replace him. Helen said her grandmother kept his memory alive for 63 years. She walked into a bedroom and returned holding a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by decades of handling. The brass hinges were tarnished but still worked. She explained that her grandmother kept it hidden in the back of her closet for years and only showed it to her a few months before she died. She told Helen that someone needed to know the truth, that history should not be allowed to bury Joseph's story. She made her promise to keep it safe. Inside the box were letters, dozens of them, written in careful handwriting on yellowed paper that crackled when touched. Rebecca's breath caught as she began to read, her hands trembling with the weight of holding something so personal and meaningful. They were love letters from Joseph to Anna, written during their short courtship in early 1905, filled with devotion and dreams of a life together. Mixed in with the romance were mentions of the cause, of dangerous work, and of men who wool. Silence them forever if they found out. One letter dated March 1905 stood out, and Rebecca read it twice to fully understand it. "My dearest Anna," it began, "I must tell you something that may change how you feel about me, and I will understand if it does. I am not simply a teamster driving wagons. I have been secretly working with union organizers, gathering information about the Employers Association's plans." Helen brought out more documents from her grandmother's collection. There were newspaper clippings Anna had carefully saved over the years, pressed between sheets of wax paper to protect them. Each clipping had been kept for a reason. Most were about the strike and its violence, but a few immediately caught Rebecca's attention. They described the Employers Association of Chicago, a powerful group of business owners formed in 1902 to destroy the growing union movement. The association represented Montgomery Ward, Sears, Roebuck, Marshall Fields, and many other major companies. "Grandma told me Joseph was trying to sneak in among the strikebreakers," Helen said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, as if the danger of 1905 was still present. "He dressed like them, hid his union ties, listened to their plans in saloons and meeting halls, and reported everything back to the union leaders. It was extremely dangerous work. If they had found him out, they would have killed him instantly, without any hesitation." Rebecca studied a photograph Helen had taken from the box. It showed about 20 men standing in front of Montgomery Ward's huge building, each one holding a rifle that shone in the sunlight. Their faces were cold and unforgiving, showing no kindness at all. "These are the strikebreakers," Helen said, pointing out faces one by one. She explained that her grandmother said Joseph recognized some of them as criminals brought in from St. Louis and other cities, men known for violence, men who took pleasure in hurting others. The Employers Association promised them $5 a day, a huge sum at the time, while regular workers earned less than $2. On top of that, they were given weapons and legal protection. If they killed a striker, they would not be punished. Everything was starting to make sense, but questions still troubled Rebecca. She looked again at the wedding photograph on her laptop, now understanding the tension on the couple's faces more clearly. The fear in their eyes was not about marriage, it was about staying alive. "The badge on the floor," Rebecca said. "Do you know why it was there? Why would Joseph risk wearing it to his own wedding?" Helen nodded slowly, her gaze drifting as she remembered her grandmother's words. Her grandmother said the wedding was meant to be quiet, just the two of them and a few trusted union friends. They chose the evening to avoid drawing attention, but someone followed them to the studio, an informant or a spy. Just before the photographer took the picture, a man burst in, demanding to know if Joseph Novak was there. Joseph had been wearing his badge under his coat, a symbol of pride. In the confusion and fear, it fell to the floor when he reached for Anna to shield her. Rebecca contacted the Chicago Police Department's Historical Records Division, asking for any files connected to Joseph Novak's death. The process was slow, and she nearly lost hope. Then, 3 weeks later, a package arrived. Inside was a manila folder holding the original 1905 investigation reports, handwritten in fountain pen on yellowed paper that smelled old and dusty. The writing was sometimes hard to read. The ink had faded, but what it revealed was shocking. The detective on the case, Patrick O'Brien, had been far more thorough than Rebecca expected. He interviewed dozens of witnesses in the days after Joseph disappeared. Most claimed they had seen nothing. Their statements were short and careful, clearly shaped by fear. Even after 100 years, that fear was still visible in the police reports. But one witness, a grocery store owner named Otto Brenner, a German immigrant, gave a detailed statement that filled 3 pages. Brenner described seeing 4 well-dressed men in suits and bowler hats, not working clothes, carrying clubs hidden under their coats. They chased Joseph Novak through an alley near South Halsted Street on the evening of April 15th. When Joseph tripped over garbage and fell, they surrounded him and beat him brutally, their clubs rising and falling, while they shouted insults about union scum and troublemakers getting what they deserved. Brenner watched from his shop window, too terrified to help, knowing he could be next. Most importantly, he identified one of the attackers as James Thorne, the son of one of Montgomery Ward's co-founders and a powerful leader in the Employers Association. Thorne was well known in Chicago's business world as a hard man who believed unions should be destroyed at any cost. When detectives tried to question him, they were blocked by lawyers and political connections that reached all the way to the mayor's office. The investigation slowed, then quietly ended with no charges filed. Rebecca searched for Thorne's name in other historical records and found something that made her heart race. During a 1906 grand jury investigation into strike violence, witnesses mentioned a special group of enforcers hired by the Employers Association. These men, brought in from places like Pittsburgh and St. Louis, were assigned to find and silence union organizers. The testimony suggested they worked with police knowledge and protection, making them almost untouchable. A photograph from the Chicago History Museum showed Thorne standing with several grim-faced men in an alley, rifles held casually in their hands. The caption described them only as security staff hired to protect Montgomery Ward during labor unrest. The answer to who betrayed Joseph came from an unexpected place: a baptism record from St. Aid, Elbert's Catholic Church, dated March 1906, nearly a year after Joseph's death. It listed the parents as Anna Novak and father deceased, and named the child Catherine Miller Novak. The middle name stood out immediately. The godfather was listed as Carl Miller, described as Anna's brother and a foreman in Montgomery Ward's shipping department. That choice seemed strange, unless there was something more behind it. Rebecca felt a chill spread through her as the connections formed. Carl Miller. K. Miller. She remembered a note she had seen in the Employers Association ledger, a payment made to K. Miller for information about union activity. Anna's own brother had betrayed Joseph, selling information that led directly to his death. The middle name was either cruel irony or Anna's way of leaving a hidden record, one only she understood. Rebecca called Helen immediately, her hands shaking as she dialed. She asked if her grandmother had a brother named Carl. There was a long silence. Rebecca could hear Helen breathing on the other end, uneven and heavy. Finally, Helen spoke. She said her grandmother never mentioned him, not once. But her mother had once said Anna had a brother who worked as a foreman at Montgomery Ward. They never spoke again after something terrible happened. Anna refused to discuss it and would leave the room if his name came up. Rebecca arranged another meeting the next day and brought copies of every document she had found. Sitting in Helen's living room, she carefully explained the evidence pointing to Carl Miller, the payments, the timing, and the access he had to sensitive information. Helen listened as tears ran down her lined face, her hands shaking as she looked at the papers spread across the table. She whispered that her grandmother must have known. She must have carried that truth for 60 years, raising her daughter without her father, knowing her own brother was responsible. Catherine's middle name was her way of remembering, of marking the betrayal forever. Rebecca then revealed one final document, a letter she had found in the Chicago Historical Society's collection, donated anonymously in 1968, the year Anna died. It was addressed to Carl Miller and dated June 1905, written in Anna's careful handwriting. The ink was slightly smeared, as if tears had fallen onto the page. 6 months later, Rebecca stood before more than 200 people at the Chicago Historical Society for the opening of a new exhibition. The gallery walls were covered with photographs, documents, and artifacts that brought that violent spring back to life. At the center, under special lighting and protective glass, hung the wedding photograph, fully restored and enlarged to 4 feet wide. The Union badge on the floor was now clearly visible. Beside it was a timeline of Joseph Novak's life, his arrival from Bohemia at age 12, his work as a teamster, his secret role as a union organizer, and his death at 27 for believing workers deserved dignity and fairness. Letters between Joseph and Anna were displayed in glass cases, proof of a love stronger than fear. The exhibit included images of strike violence, newspaper reports from both sides, and clear evidence of Carl Miller's betrayal taken from the Employers Association's own records. Rebecca had also found living descendants of Joseph and Anna. Helen stood beside her, surrounded by relatives who had never known this part of their history. Many cried as they learned about their ancestors' courage and sacrifice. Some brought their children and grandchildren, wanting them to understand where they came from. Dr. Patterson spoke to the crowd, his voice shaped by decades of studying labor history. He said Joseph Novak represented thousands of forgotten workers who risked everything for justice. The 1905 strike failed, unions were crushed, and men like Joseph died without recognition. But their sacrifice planted seeds. Years later, during the Great Depression, workers would rise again and finally win the rights Joseph had fought for: the 8-hour day, safe working conditions, fair pay, and the right to organize without fear. After the crowd slowly moved through the exhibits, Rebecca returned to the photograph one last time. She looked at Joseph's face and no longer saw only a groom. She saw the burden he carried that night, the knowledge that he was marked for death, the courage to keep fighting anyway, and the love for Anna that made him hope for a future he somehow knew he would never reach.